I have always been a pretty reclusive kid growing up. I'm not much different now as an adult, but still, this event did not help me change. Anyways, because I wasn't outgoing, I often stayed home when my parents would go out. So when they went to a friend's birthday party and I was invited to join them, I declined and decided to stay home and just have the place to myself for a few hours. I was a 16-year-old boy and I'd stayed home plenty of times before, so it was no big deal. The evening started fine. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, probably eating some junk food, when someone knocked on the door. It was odd because it wasn't like anyone was expected over, and my friends don't ever just show up unannounced. So I answered. It was a normal-looking guy, maybe in his 30s or so, except he was kind of fidgety and overly curious. I just looked at him and he asked if Alan lived here. I told him no. My name was not Alan, nor was it my dad or brother's name. He stared at me for a few seconds and then apologized, saying he must have the wrong address, and solemnly walked off. I closed the door, thinking it was weird, and just went back to my night. A few hours later, I started playing a game on the computer in our living room when there was a knock on the door. Now, I was curious as well as annoyed. I answered again, and this time it was a different guy, but he looked a bit more rough. And this time he said, "Hey, let me talk to Alan." What were the odds that two people would ask for the same person at the same house in the same night? I again told him there was no one here by that name, and he tried to look past me into our house like he didn't believe me. Now, the guy was much bigger than me, so I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little intimidated by him, but I was going to try and stand my ground. So I started closing the door more, limiting his view, and again said that I knew no one by that name, that no one named Alan lived here, and I tried my best to give a bit of a big and scary face. He smirked and said that if he found out that he was in there, and that I'd lied, that he would come back. And I'll just say that he said he would make me regret it. I just said okay and shut the door, watching him walk away from the window. I didn't like that there were two guys now that showed up and one threatened me, so I called my parents and told them what happened. They told me they would try to get home soon, but told me to make sure that both doors are locked and to keep the curtains closed, and also to not answer the door again. So I hung up and went back to my night. I started getting tired, so I got off the computer and went back to the couch, hoping to fall asleep. By this time, it was dark out. I don't remember the exact time, and I was actually drifting off when I damn near had a heart attack. Someone was banging very hard and very loudly on the front door, making me jump up. Except this time, the person was shouting that they were the police. They were demanding that I open the door or they were going to force it down. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. My parents had told me not to answer the door for anyone, but it was also the police. I grabbed the phone and called my parents again, but as I explained to them what had happened, I felt the urgency to open the door. So I did. They immediately ran in, one of them forcing me to the ground, making me drop the phone. Two more went in and started searching the house. The cop that stayed with me helped me up, leaving the phone behind, and led me outside, asking me a barrage of questions about who I was, and then put me in the back of his cruiser. I sat there freaking out. There were cops walking around my home. Why were they there, and why did they treat me like I was the bad guy? I was shaking from fear and being cold, as I was in just my pajamas, and it was a colder night down in New Mexico. I just hoped that my parents would be home soon, and that everything would get cleared up. Thankfully, that sort of happened. I saw my parents show up, and my mom started arguing with another cop standing by the car that I was in, demanding that they let her see me. And then the cop that put me in the back came back out and talked to my parents, then let me out. With them standing there, they asked us if we knew someone named Alan. Who the hell was Alan? I explained what happened that night, and my parents confirmed my story. The cops then said that they received a tip about him staying there at our house. He said he was assumed to be armed and dangerous. They asked if anyone came over asking to stay there, and we told them no. But we did have the two people come looking for him. The cops said that was definitely alarming, and said that it could have been a friend that heard something similar, or even worse, someone he owed money to. They basically said that if they come back, to not answer the door, and to call them immediately. That made me feel really good. I may have come face to face with someone with some very bad intentions. Overall, they obviously let me go, and we all got to go back inside, with minimal destruction having occurred. Mostly, all of the doors and lights were on, and any place a person could hide, they searched. I was still pretty shaken up, and then I had the fear of answering the door for a while. My parents also didn't like me staying home alone after that. But those guys never came back, and we never ran into the now infamous Alan. However, now when that name does come up, my parents and I have a good laugh. Before I fully tell this story that I want to tell, I would like to get a few things out of the way. The first thing I want to mention is that the story is disturbing, and it should probably have some sort of trigger warning on it, so I do ask that you mention this in your narration. The story does involve child abuse to some extent, specifically an abusive drunk father, and I know that topic could very well be sensitive to a lot of people. The only reason that I've decided to submit this story is because of how disturbing it can be. I know you read stories for people's entertainment, and I fully understand that this submission will be seen as that by a lot of people, but I feel it's important to get this out there. If not for me, then for the person that it happened to. Alright, that out of the way, I also feel that this story needs to be set up a little bit. The story is about a person that I would say was my best friend from the start. His name was Ronnie, and Ronnie lived a few houses down from me, just around the corner, on an intersecting street to the one that I grew up on. We had the same teacher in kindergarten, which is where we met, and we were put in the same class through all of elementary school. Ronnie and I shared everything, from hobbies to secrets. He knew everything about me, all there was to know about a kid that age, I guess, and I knew everything about him. Except there was one thing about him that was always strange to me. When we played, he was always at my house, or another friend's house on the block. I never went to his house. Even when I was that age, I always sensed there was something wrong with that scenario. If one of us mentioned going to his house, he would do a complete 180 and get quiet or try to make an excuse or change the subject. Ronnie was a good kid. He was outgoing and exceptionally bright, which made it strange that he would practically shrink if anyone mentioned his house. In hindsight, his reaction should have been a clue as to what was happening, but as a kid it was just a thing that was weird and mysterious. As we grew up a bit and transitioned into middle school, we stayed good friends, but some of that veil over Ronnie's home life started to lift. Around that time, Ronnie started to be a bit more reclusive, and he would flinch at sudden movements. He would become unnaturally quiet when someone got mad at him for anything. There was one day when one of our teachers in middle school got mad at the class and yelled at us, and he basically went into a panic attack. After class, I was able to catch up with him and talk him down some, trying to figure out what was going on. That was when he told me about his home life. To say that Ronnie's father was strict was an understatement. I would later learn that Ronnie's dad was a towering figure, in both stature and presence, and that he expected Ronnie to be perfect in literally every aspect. Worse yet, Ronnie's father was far from perfect. He was an alcoholic, and when he drank, he would get angry and very aggressive about pretty much everything. When he was a kid, it was just verbal abuse. But as Ronnie hit his early teen years, his father graduated to a more physical approach to parenting. This was why Ronnie was always so involved in class. He was a straight-A student, and he always applied himself 100% in everything he did. However, there were times when this wasn't quite enough for his father, and the threats of the consequences were starting to inch closer and closer to him following through. By the time we reached high school, the pressure on Ronnie had visibly intensified. He was juggling extracurricular activities, was put in the gifted program, and advanced classes because of how well he always did. And by the second quarter of our freshman year, I could see that it was physically taking its toll on him. I know that this was a long setup, but this is actually where everything happened. Our freshman year. Ronnie was in the same biology class as myself. It was the only advanced class that I was ever in, and we had the same period. The teacher, Mr. Henson, had given us a research project that was pretty intense, but it was expected in an advanced class. Part of the project required us to properly cite all of our references in our final printed documentation, and he made it very clear that citations were 50% of the grade. So, if you didn't do it, you would fail the project. Unfortunately, Ronnie apparently stumbled on this project, something that practically never happened. In the whirlwind of everything going on in his life, he had apparently turned in a printed draft of his project, one that didn't have the citations on it, and as such, he got an F. I stuck around after class. It was our last period for the day, and we always went to the bus together, and I witnessed what had happened. He pleaded with Mr. Henson after class, and I could tell that he was on the verge of tears the whole time. He begged him to let him fix it, that he had the final draft and that he had just printed the wrong one. Mr. Henson was, unfortunately, one of those teachers that refused to bend the rules at all. He told Ronnie that it was too late, and that it was just that one report, that it wasn't the end of the world. I heard Ronnie tell him in no uncertain words that his father was going to kill him. Mr. Henson shrugged it off and said that he was sure his father would understand, that accidents happen, and that he would just have to do better in the future. We walked to the bus after that, and I could tell that the fear in Ronnie's eyes was very real. I think that was really the first time that the burden that he carried was truly visible. I knew things were hard, but I don't think it actually hit me how bad it was or could be for him until that moment. I offered to come over and explain that the teacher was a jerk to his dad. I know that it wouldn't have helped, but I was trying to think of anything that would give him a fighting chance. I told him to just come over to my place, and that we would talk to my parents and figure something out. But Ronnie told me that if I got involved, it would just make things worse. I sat by him on the bus, and we were both silent the whole way home. I didn't even try to make a comment because I knew that it wouldn't matter. And the rest of that evening remains a huge painted blur in my memory. I knew that it was bad, but again, I guess part of my brain wouldn't let me believe that it was as bad as it was. I did mention it to my mom. I struggled to get the words out, but I told her that I thought Ronnie was in trouble, that he'd gotten an F, and that he was terrified that his father was going to kill him. She talked to me about the situation, but ultimately there wasn't much that we could do. She could call the cops and have them check on him, but then what? That'd probably make it worse for Ronnie, and his dad may actually kill him. I could go over and try to see if he was okay, but Ronnie had specifically said that he was worried that that would make his dad angrier. Eventually, we both settled on me calling after dinner to check on him, and that I would make some excuse about not remembering what homework was due or something. Something believable that wouldn't be likely to raise any alarms. But even with that, I was still worried that his dad would freak out on him. But I never got to make that call. Around 6 p.m., while we were eating dinner, we heard sirens racing down the street. Then more sirens. Then more. My mind immediately went to Ronnie, and I thought that his dad had actually done it. That the cops were going to arrest his father for murdering his only son. That's not quite how things went down, though. Most of the details are still unknown to me, but here's what I know happened. Ronnie went home to face his father, to try and explain the situation, and to try to tell him that it was a mistake like Mr. Henson had said. I guess he figured that things were going to be bad either way, so maybe he could do what another adult had recommended and it could work. Well, it didn't. By the time Ronnie got home, his dad was already a few knuckles deep, and was already at that point that he was agitated. Ronnie tried to avoid him, but at some point he had gone through Ronnie's backpack, found the report, and lost it. This wasn't the first time he had physically assaulted Ronnie, but it was the most violent he had ever been. The injuries that Ronnie ended up with were pretty intense, including several broken bones, and he was going to need to go to the hospital with how badly he'd been beaten, which then set his father off even more. And it escalated to the point that Ronnie said he honestly thought he was going to die. In the heat of everything that was happening, the other victim of Ronnie's father, his mother, had hit a point of no return. She watched her husband beat her son several times, at this point until he was bloodied and beaten, and she knew that she had to do something. It was at this point that she made a decision that was desperate, but she knew that if she didn't do it, Ronnie wasn't going to make it. She grabbed the handgun that Ronnie had kept hidden in the bedroom, ran back into the living room, and she pulled the trigger. She ended up shooting him until there was nothing left in the gun, including several shots after he was lying on the ground. I stepped outside from the table, and I watched the police cars, fire rescue, and ambulances pull up as quickly as they could to the house. There was so much chaos in those moments that night. I watched as the door to the house that I never visited opened up, and the paramedics rushed the stretcher with Ronnie on it into the back of the ambulance. I watched his mother get brought out in cuffs, and watched as the officers blocked the entrance and yard with crime scene tape. Obviously, all of the neighbors saw the aftermath, and there was a lot of confusion and turmoil. My mind was just on Ronnie, and whether or not he was going to get through it. By the end of everything, Ronnie's home life was laid bare for all to see. The information about the abuse, his father's drinking, all of it was thrown out for the nosy vultures to eat up. Ronnie was placed in the care of his aunt while his mother went through the legal proceedings. In the end, somehow, his mother was acquitted on the grounds of self-defense and the protection of her child, despite the fact that she pulled the trigger more times than was necessary. I do not personally blame her for doing that. It's just the one detail that could have easily landed her in prison for the rest of her life. A few months later, Ronnie and his aunt came over to our house for a while so that Ronnie and I could hang out. It was nice to see him, but the trauma of that night had changed him. He was withdrawn, an absolute shadow of the kid that he once was. He was still my best friend, and I loved him as much as a best friend could, but he wasn't himself anymore, and I didn't blame him for that either. Years have passed since this all happened, but the lessons that it taught me remain. I learned about the masks that people wear, hiding their pain and fear behind a facade of normalcy. I learned about how resilient that kid down the street can be, how he could be an absolute genius and a great friend in spite of the fact that his home life was traumatic. I wish that I could have done more for him, but back then, I had no idea what I was supposed to do other than just be there for him if he needed me. What ended up happening was, unfortunately, an event that was more or less written in stone. Someone in that family was bound to end up dead because of his father's abuse. And in this case, it just happened to be the abuser himself. Ronnie ended up moving out of state, and I haven't spoken to him in almost a decade. I hope that he found peace, and I hope that he knows, despite everything, he was never alone. Our friendship, though forever altered by that night, formed the best days of my life, and I would welcome him back into my life in a heartbeat. Hello. I wanted to share a weird and kind of unexplained situation that I was involved in that I really feel like could have saved my life. Back in 2014, I was pretty heavily into online dating. I'd been single for about 8 months after my ex decided to break it off and move across the country with no warning. I was gutted, and yeah, pretty lonely since he had moved in with me, so I was ready to spend my time with someone again. So I started with dating memberships and apps, wherever I could go that was free or didn't cost a whole paycheck. And that's where I met this guy, Jackson. Jackson messaged me first with a pretty normal greeting.
Hello, stranger. I'd love to get to know you more.
I remembered it because it wasn't the desperate pleas that you normally see there. You know the ones, where they call you beautiful and beg you to talk to them, and if you're lucky, maybe some kind of raunchy comment. I looked at his profile and he was definitely easy on the eyes. In fact, he looked like my ex. Shaved head, normal build, wearing sunglasses and holding his dog. Maybe that's my toxic trait, looking for someone that reminded me of my ex, right? So I responded to him, and we began talking, and there was a lot of it. He asked a lot of questions about me and who I was. He was more than willing to share about himself, too, and even sent me a few more pictures of himself and his pup. He asked about meeting up, but I wasn't quite ready yet. I also didn't want him to think that I was just looking for a one-night stand, which was also common on these sites. He was understanding and didn't push it, which was another win for me. But then one night, I was having a particularly grumpy night. He texted me and was talking about a local carnival that was going on. I joked about how I hadn't been in years, and he sounded appalled. He said this one in particular was the best one held in the state, and said that I had to go. And then he offered to take me. And this time I agreed. Going to a carnival as a first date was definitely unconventional, but I liked that. I could even dress comfortably, and we could just have fun and maybe even skip the awkward silent moments. We met that Saturday night at the carnival, and he looked just like his pictures, so that was a good start. He hugged me when we first met, and it felt so nice. I was already in a fantastic mood, and was excited to see where the night would take us. We took a few rides, played a few games, and joked about how many were still rigged, and even tried to figure out how they did it. We also sampled tons of different food, which was all fantastic. We were walking around, waiting for a show to start, and made our way to the part of the carnival that they referred to as oddities and curiosities, or something to that effect. And that's where we saw a guy playing a musical instrument with his toes. There was a lady juggling swords, and then there was also a tent for a fortune teller. Yeah, Call me what you want, but I'm all for that kind of stuff. I liked tarot, crystal work, all of it. I even had a friend that I became really close to that read my tarot and my tea leaves quite often. I won't say that I necessarily believed all of it, I was a skeptic, but some things I couldn't explain away, so I felt there had to be some kind of truth to it. So when I saw her sign, I absolutely wanted to check her out and see what she might say. And even if she had any thoughts or compatibility ideas with us. Jackson didn't have a problem with it, and he liked the idea too, so we went in. She greeted us, said that her name was Madame Joe, and asked what we were looking for. Jackson shrugged, smiling, and asked what I or Joe would suggest. She guessed that we were on our first date, and I confirmed, smiling too. Off to a good start, right? She said that she could do palm reading and get some compatibility, and even maybe some future readings, so that's what we agreed to. We both sat in the chair across from her, and she started reading our individual palms. She started on mine, and she mentioned how she could sense that I was still recovering, or had sadness from a previous loss. She was right, too, as I was still dealing with losing my ex. And then she read Jackson's, and that's when I started sensing a change in her. She quickly opened her eyes, and basically told him that he was holding in a lot of anger, and that he needed to confront it before he hurt somebody else that he loved. Jackson looked confused, and didn't say another word, but Joe seemed uncomfortable. Then she grabbed both of our hands, and immediately her face soured. No, this will never work, she said like a disapproving parent. We both looked at her confused, and she continued. You, sir, are a very dangerous man. You hurt everyone you've loved, and this will be no different. Jackson quickly pulled his hand back, his face a mix of confusion and anger. I, however, did not move, curious what she meant by this. She continued talking about how he would hurt me, and I was running out of time to leave him. She said that she saw black and blue all over bare skin. She held my hand with both of hers, and with fear in her eyes, she looked at me and said, "Do not let this continue. Please, before it's too late." And then let go of my hand. Jackson started going off. He asked who she was, and accused her of being in some kind of scheme set up by some other person, trying to sabotage his date. I don't remember the name, but it was a female. Maybe an ex? I never found out. But she said that she wasn't, and claimed that he told her all she needed to know. He called her crazy and said that he never believed in this crap, and then grabbed my hands to pull me out. I was so confused and startled by this. He pulled me out of the tent and again tried to talk about how those people were always full of hot air and just after your money. He tried laughing and lightening the mood, but it was a little harder for me to just forget it. We went to the show, but I was so distracted by the psychic, and Jackson had to ask me several times if I was okay. After the show, he asked about doing something else there, but I told him that I was just ready to go home. He seemed to be pretty offended by this. We had seen most of the carnival already, so unless he wanted to go somewhere else, I don't know what he was expecting. He then asked, "This doesn't have anything to do with that psychic, does it? You don't really believe in that crap, do you?" He sounded very angry and accusatory even, and it honestly made me uncomfortable. So I just laughed and told him no, and that I was just honestly tired. It was after 10 p.m., and I joked that I wasn't used to being out so late, and that was all. He calmed down and then hugged me, saying that he would talk soon, and we parted ways. The whole drive home, my heart was racing. Fortune tellers can't really see the future, right? Was she jealous? Could she have been in on something? But his reaction to it, and his reaction to me, that was all really alarming. I knew that I was really going to have to be careful if I continued to see him. He messaged me the next day, asking how I was, and asking if I wanted to go get dinner that night. I thought that I should give him another chance. Being we would be in public again, maybe I could see him from a different perspective and let his actions make a decision for me, not Madame Joe's. So, I agreed. We went to a local restaurant and everything was going as normal. Our conversation was fine, his attitude was fine. It was just a normal date. It really made me loosen up, and I was starting to think that I was really being crazy, freaking out over what some stranger told me. So, by the end, I'd been very cheerful, laughing and just having a great night. By the end of the dinner, we started walking out and he followed me to my car, thinking he was just being kind and walking me to it. But then, he got uncomfortably close to me. I think under other circumstances it may have been romantic, but something was making me nervous again. So when the conversation didn't continue, I thanked him for dinner and moved to try to unlock my car. Apparently this was the wrong decision. He once again became unglued and said, "So that's it." I looked at him confused. He started making remarks about me getting a free meal and him getting nothing in return. I asked him what he meant because I definitely offered to pay, but he wouldn't let me. He then made a comment about coming back to my place, and I declined. I told him, as I did before we even met the first time, that I wasn't here for that, and that he was not going to get anything from me after 2 dates. He became furious. He started yelling, demanding that I tell him why and what was wrong with him. As he backed up to literally scream, I jumped into my car, locking the door instantly. He ran up to my car and kicked it hard enough to shake it. He'd now gotten the attention of some people nearby, so I took the opportunity and left. I drove around for about 10 minutes before going home to make sure that he didn't find me and follow me home. And from there, I ran inside, locking the door behind me. He tried calling several times, but I ignored them all. That didn't stop him from sending mixed messages via voicemails and texts. I just turned off my phone and went to sleep. The next day, I actually called my friend who did tarot and asked her to read a little bit about Jackson and what our future looked like together. Now, mind you, I did not tell her about Madame Joe. At this point, I had told one person, and that was my mom. That was it. So when she told me something similar to Joe, I was pretty freaked out. I explained to her what happened at the carnival, and she agreed that I needed to end it with him, and that something dangerous was going to happen. So I did just that. I messaged him that day and told him that I didn't think it was going to work out, and just ended it there. He sent more conflicting messages between begging me for another chance and calling me some unsavory names. Then he finished it off with a threat. I told him that I would be reporting him to the police, and he didn't respond. I didn't hear from him again, though, thankfully. But he still had me paranoid for a little while. He lived in the next county over, so while he didn't live too close, he also didn't live that far away. I feared that I may run into him at a store, somewhere, or at a restaurant. I tried to avoid the place that we had gone to for dinner unless I was with company, in case he showed up too. I feel like I got very lucky in this situation. I don't know about his past or what he may have done, but sometimes I did think about it. I considered looking for an ex, but I feared what I may find, so I just left it alone. All I know is that I feel like going to that carnival was one of the best and worst dates I have ever had. And I thank Madame Joe for possibly saving my life. This happened to me in late 2019. That year, I was at my lowest that I had been my whole life. Between multiple life and work events, I struggled daily, but after doing some soul searching, I stopped feeling sorry for myself and started making the changes I wanted, or more so needed, to live a better life. I was working on getting a better job, one that I could actually show my value in, while also working on myself. I got a gym membership and I was spending a lot of my free time there. I was happier with myself, dare I say it, even more confident. But another part of my life I wanted to fill was someone to spend my time with. So I started a few dating sites to try and get myself out there. I was still overweight, no way to hide that, but I was working on it and making good progress. So I put on a flattering shirt, spent some time on my hair and makeup, and took some good photos for my profile. I can't speak for men, but I know a lot of us ladies like to look our best in pictures, so of course I went a little extra on it. I didn't lie in my bio though, claiming I was 180 and super slim or anything. I just wanted a little extra glam to my photos. I got a few guys to reply. Some were willing to talk, but would ghost me when I declined an immediate hookup. Or some would just immediately start off wrong, if you know what I mean. But then there was a guy named Clayton, or Clay, that contacted me. He was cute. His picture showed him standing in the back of a pickup wearing some dirty jeans with a big goofy smile on his face. You could tell he was a little heavier himself, which I didn't mind. I was working on the same thing, so. And the fact that he wasn't this sharp, clean guy in his photo made me think that he was probably more laid back and flexible. We started talking, and we seemed to have a lot in common. We talked as if we had known each other for years. It was just that easy and natural. I was pretty happy when he asked about getting together for dinner, and I agreed immediately. We scheduled it for the upcoming weekend, and I could not wait. Except there was a problem. I have a pretty serious skin condition called psoriasis that will randomly flare up, sometimes without much warning. Most of it is on my legs and arms, sometimes my back, but the worst of it comes up on my face. It can be pretty red and inflamed, and the only thing I can really do for it is use a good lotion or moisturizer and hope that it calms down. But the problem this time was that it flared up the worst the night prior to the date. There was no way that I was going to cancel so close. I thought that that would surely make him think I wasn't interested, and it was very rude to do so. So instead of doing my full makeup like I liked to do, because it worsens the flare-up, I settled with a good moisturizer, good eye makeup, and a nice lipstick to hopefully distract from the awful patches on my cheeks and chin. I talked myself up before I left, and told myself that I just needed to be confident, and be willing to talk about it if he asked. It's unfortunately something that happens, and there's not much that I can do about it. We met up at the restaurant, and I found him waiting outside. He was wearing a nicer pair of jeans and a nice sweater. He looked great, and I was thankful that I wasn't too over or underdressed. I was in a sweater dress and tights trying to cover up my arms and my legs. So I felt like we both fit in, and together well enough. I approached him with all smiles, and he returned the sentiment, shaking my hand. We went in and got seated, and as we tried our best with small talk, I could sense the awkwardness in the air. I assumed it was just meeting in person for the first time. Made sense, right? But then I started to notice that he was talking less and less, and was constantly looking around the restaurant. I don't know if he was trying to look for someone or what, but he definitely seemed to be distracted. It was starting to look less like he was just shy or awkward, and more so disinterested in the date. I was pretty upset. Dealing with this most of my life, I knew that it had to deal with me. It had to be the mess that was on my face, right? Or maybe just me in general. He was no longer interested. That's just the person I was. So, when the check came, I was planning on paying, not wanting him to have to pay for me, but he immediately told the server it was 2 checks, so I just paid for myself. But I was surprised when he asked if I wanted to walk around a local park. He sounded sincere when he asked, so I loosened up thinking maybe I had just misread the whole situation. Maybe I was just being pessimistic, and he really was just shy. We both drove our own cars, and I followed him to the park. I got out, smiling again while his smile seemed fake. We started walking, his hands remaining in his pockets, so I kept mine at my sides or holding the strap on my bag. I tried talking to him, but he would give short answers, if he replied at all. Then, as we rounded the trail, he finally brought it up. "So, how come you look different from your photos?" I was pretty embarrassed. He definitely noticed my face, which only made me want to look away from him. I explained to him that I just had foundation on to smooth out my blemishes. I explained my skin condition and how I couldn't do the same thing in my pictures because of it. I even apologized and joked that I should have asked him to reschedule, but I didn't want to disappoint him. He didn't laugh, he didn't smirk, or anything, which told me he was pretty serious about this. I didn't hide anything on my profile. I had both headshots as well as full body photos, and I was the same size as I took them after I started losing weight, but I was still clearly around 250 pounds. The only difference was that I was now wearing less makeup, but I guess that was a pretty big deal to him. I was already pretty mortified, and knowing he was fairly upset, I slowed down, told him I would just go, and apologized for wasting his time. But then I felt him grab my arm, tightly, making me turn back around to look at him. His face was now fairly red and angry. "You catfished me. This is the problem with you women. You think you can just get away with this and we're just going to accept it?" He called me some pretty hurtful things, each time yanking my arm towards him, but I would pull back. He finally let go of my arm, but it made me lose my balance, and I fell to the ground. He immediately stood over me, calling me more names. I was scared and upset, obviously crying, so I yelled at him that I got the message and to just let me leave. But then he dropped to his knees, trying to restrain my hands, and also kept grabbing my face to make me look at him. I didn't know what he was planning to do. He was obviously angry and very violent. Why not just tell me off and let me go? Why do all this? But then, my hero. There was a couple walking the same path that witnessed this. The man immediately ran over to us, shouting, and Clay jumped off of me, now trying to intimidate the other guy. The girl tried to slowly walk around to get me, so I stumbled to get to my feet to meet her halfway. Clay shoved the guy a few times, and that was about all that happened. The other guy told him to walk away before he knocked him out, and he finally did. Walk away, that is. The girl hugged me, and they asked me if I was okay and stayed with me until the police arrived. I told them everything that happened, and they then followed me home. I showed them Clay's profile, but all calls were going straight to voicemail. They said that they would follow up on it and keep me updated as I wanted to press charges. No surprise, though, his profile on the site was gone the next day. That was easily one of the worst days of my life. I was working so hard to improve myself. I had already lost 25 pounds and was feeling better about myself and life. I put myself out there again, and because my face wasn't what it was on the profile, I was assaulted, berated, and made fun of. Why not just end it at the restaurant? why would you continue with it? Or even, why not just call it out there and let me walk away? Sure, I guess I'm not completely innocent since he said he felt catfished, but that wasn't my intention, nor did I deserve the way that he treated me. I started to shut myself in after that, and then with 2020, I didn't even have to explain myself to anyone for it. I am doing better these days. I've dropped more weight after gaining the quarantine weight, and I've gone on a few dates since. My profile now includes information on my skin condition, and while it may have swayed some people, I've also had some messages asking me about it, and even a few that said they had the same thing. The police were able to track down Clay, but he fled. Most likely the state, so I believe there's now a warrant out for him. I was always worried that he would come around and find me, but I hold on to the thought that he truly may not be in the state. I just hope that he never hurts another woman like he did me. This happened about 3 years ago, but I still think about it from time to time, and it still creeps me out. I, 21, male at the time, had just moved into a new apartment on the first floor of a building. It was late one night and my roommate was out when somebody knocked on the door. This wasn't uncommon as we were in college, and my roommate had friends that would come over and hang out at all hours of the day. I just figured it was one of his friends, so I get up and check the peephole. Staring right back at me through the peephole is an eyeball pressed against it. Again, this is something that one of our friends might do just to be funny. I chuckled and opened the door, surprised to see a guy in his mid-20s that I didn't recognize. He was strange, to say the least. He was very hyper and immediately launched into a door-to-door salesman type pitch. I can't remember exactly what he was even selling, but it was something about the local university, which I also attended at the time. The whole time he was talking, he kept looking past me into the apartment. He was fidgeting and even standing on his tiptoes to see inside. Still, I just thought this guy was weird and nervous, and might not have been all there. I politely declined to buy anything from him, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. I finally had to be pretty stern in telling him that I was not interested. He finally accepted defeat, and as I was closing the door, he put his hand out and stopped the door from closing. Before I could be like, "What the hell, dude?" He smiles at me and says, "I like Mario Kart on the Nintendo 64 too." Now, me and my roommate had been staying up late into the night, playing Mario Kart 64 in my bedroom for the past several days before that. But there was nothing that he could see from the apartment entrance that had anything to do with Mario Kart. I was taken aback, and trying to add things up in my head, and confusingly asked, "How do you know I play Mario Kart?" He then got super nervous and said, I just thought that anyone with a couch like that would be into Mario Kart on the Nintendo 64. Because, it's like a retro game, and that's a retro couch." But what the hell was that explanation? Then he was just like, "Okay, bye," and literally scurried away. I shut the door and locked it. I start trying to put the pieces together on how we could have known that, because obviously it wasn't because of my grandma's old couch. Remember, it's a first-floor apartment that backed up into the woods. My roommate got home shortly after that, and I immediately tell him about this encounter. He was freaked out too, so we started to investigate. At first, it seemed as if there was no way to even see inside my bedroom. My blinds were always down. We went outside and tested it, and found that the only way to see inside would have been if you had your face right up against the window. And even then, you kind of had to crouch and close one eye just to get a glimpse of the inside. A couple more creepy details. My window was over a balcony, and the Nintendo 64 console itself was stored inside of the TV stand and was not visible. You'd only be able to see it while we were actively playing, which we never did until we were a little stoned and it was like 2 in the morning. So, basically, this freaking creep had been jumping the railing to our balcony, pressing his face against my window, and watching us play Mario Kart in the middle of the night. I never saw the guy again, but needless to say, I was pretty paranoid for a while after that. I constantly checked my windows and woke up in the middle of the night, paranoid that he was standing just a couple feet away, watching me sleep. This was just a very unsettling encounter. I'm glad that nothing more ever came of it, and that I never saw him again. But I have always wondered what his motives were. Hey, Raven. I have a story from you when I was a child back in the 90s, and I feel really old now. I hope you're doing good, friend. Thank you. I was 6 or 7, and I would walk home after school. We lived really close to the local school at the time. Since my parents both worked, I was expected to do everything myself. When I tell people this story now, they tend to be surprised that I was allowed to do this. I liked it. I had my own key, and I would follow the rules. Which were, don't answer the phone, and wait to listen to the answering machine to see if it was Mum or Dad, and to not answer the door. Legally, I don't think I was allowed to be left alone so young, but hey, I was fine. I got in, locked the door, put my bag down, and went to the fridge for an after-school snack. I turned on the TV to watch some cartoons. My parents would be back after 6 p.m., so I had to get the chicken out of the freezer, set the table, and do some basic tidying around the house. I honestly loved having this alone time to myself. My mom called me and reminded me to sort the laundry, and then said that we would talk more when they got home. I agreed, took the laundry out and hung it on the clothesline because my parents are too cheap to use the dryer. When I noticed someone looking over the fence. He didn't look like any of my neighbors, and none of the houses went on the market recently. I finished up, closed and locked the back door. My parents didn't have cell phones, obviously. They were too expensive at the time, and I don't think they wanted a call anyways. I went to all the windows and doors to make sure they were locked, and that he couldn't come in. Once I was done, I settled in front of the TV with my snacks and relaxed, completely ignoring my homework. Then I looked over and saw that there was a shadow at the window. It was the same man. He used his hands to shield his eyes to get a better look inside, and I noticed him looking at me. I flipped him off. I was a cheeky kid, and I told him to go away. He did. I breathed a sigh of relief and went back to watching TV. I then heard the doorknob rattling, and it was like someone was trying to get into the house. Even though I hadn't done anything wrong, I felt guilty. I looked at the phone, wondering whether I should just call the police. This was the first time I had something like this happen, and everything my parents told me to do went out the window. Not literally, figure of speech. He came back to the window and then knocked on it, pointing to the door. I heard him tell me to let him in. He didn't have any sort of uniform on, so I shook my head and told him that my parents were coming home soon. He got angry this time. He started hitting the window hard and started swearing at me. I know these words probably wouldn't be shocking to many people, but it was the first time that I'd really heard an adult talk like that. especially towards me or any other child. I thought that he was going to break through the glass. I went to the home phone and lifted it up, and then dialed the emergency number. He could see me dialing it, and he got even angrier. We didn't have a cordless phone either. It was the kind that had the long spiral cord that had a set limit. The best I could do was hide around the hallway, but he could still tell where I was. I got to the police, told them what was happening, and they could hear the window banging. The operator told me to stay on the line, but by this point, I was bawling. I asked her if I was going to die. It felt like it was forever, and then suddenly the man stopped knocking. The quiet actually felt more unsettling. She told me that the police should be there now, but to only open the door if I could see them. I looked through the window, and I saw 2 police officers standing there. They were knocking on the door. I then opened the door, and they asked if they could come in and if I was okay. They came in, and my parents got the shock of a lifetime when they saw a cop car out the front, and came in. I told them what happened, and they all told me that I did the right thing. There were actually reports of this guy trying to get into other houses around the local area. The cops told my parents that they shouldn't have left me alone, but that was as far as that went. I would love to say that things changed, but my parents decided that this was just an experience that would toughen me up. And in a way, I guess it did. It scared me as a kid, though. I had some nightmares about it, where I wondered whether he would ever come back. I have a story that is probably one of the most disturbing things to have ever happened to my family. I say my family because it was more so my grandparents, but it's something that has been kind of held close to all of us since it happened. All of this happened on my grandparents' property, and my grandpa was even looked at as a suspect for a moment, but was eventually cleared for the whole thing. Even still, this whole event was devastating for my grandfather, for reasons that will be obvious in a little while. I do need to give a small bit of context, so bear with me while I detail a few things. This happened quite a long time ago. My dad was still in his teens when this took place, so it was way before my time. My grandparents lived in the northwestern part of the US, and they owned a decent amount of land there. It all belonged to my great-great-grandfather, and had been passed down twice at this point to my grandfather, Ronald. On the land that they owned, in the southern corner, complete opposite of my grandparents' actual house, was a small cabin that, way back, was where the hired help on the land lived. By the time my grandfather got the land, the cabin was empty, and was used more for storage than anything. Still, they kept it up, and made sure that if anyone ever wanted or needed to stay in the cabin, they could. My grandfather kept the land around it tidy, and kept it up on the maintenance of the building. It is important to mention that this cabin, being on the opposite end of the property, was nowhere near the house. In order to get to the cabin, you would have to get on the road, circle around the property until you hit the south end, and then pull up the driveway to get to it. In the fall of 1965, my grandfather's cousin, Walter, a man that helped raise my grandfather because they were separated by about 12 years, came to visit my grandpa, and asked him if he could stay in the cabin for a little while. Apparently, Walter had, in his words, fallen on hard times, and needed somewhere to stay for a couple of months. My grandfather didn't ask him any questions about what had happened, because Walter was family, and he said that Walter was welcome to stay for as long as he needed. Obviously, my grandpa was suspicious that something was going on, that Walter had done something illegal or questionable, because he'd been in with some questionable people in the past. But again, he was family. and my grandpa never questioned family or left them in the cold. He was a man that didn't say much, but he was very loyal to those that he knew and loved, because that's how he was raised. A few weeks passed, and Walter had set up his home in the cabin. My grandfather went over to visit with him a few times over the first week to see how he was doing. Walter seemed a bit nervous at first, but as the first month came and went, he seemed a lot more comfortable and less on edge. Again, red flags, I know, but my grandfather was confident that Walter would be able to handle whatever it was. He did ask him if he should be worried for himself and his wife at one point, but Walter told him that everything was fine, and that he would just be there a few months until things settled down, and then he would be out of his hair. Again, questionable comments being made there, but in the end, my grandpa just said that Walter was free to stay as long as he needed, told him where the ammo for the hunting rifle in the cabin was, then went back home to my grandmother and my father. A couple more weeks passed, and my grandpa hadn't heard much from Walter. And that Saturday, he decided he would take the trip around to see how he was, and to ask if he wanted to help with some work that he needed to do. He pulled his truck up to the cabin, and immediately felt like something was off. Walter's car wasn't in the driveway, but the door to the cabin was wide open. My grandpa thought initially that Walter had to take off in a hurry and left the door open. Obviously this bothered him, but it would have been the better alternative to what did end up happening. My grandpa walked up to the cabin and called out for his cousin, but there was no response. Then he walked in. He knew immediately that something horrible had happened. My grandfather always described what he saw as a scene straight out of his worst nightmares. The furniture in the cabin was overturned and destroyed. One of the windows was shattered, with the glass on the inside of the cabin, meaning it had been broken in, and the air was thick with that coppery scent of blood. There was a massive dark stain on the carpet in the living room, and a trail that led from there out the back door of the cabin, like the person that was bleeding had been dragged out of the cabin. Then he noticed the large, bloody knife that was stabbed into the cabinet, pinning a piece of paper to it. And my grandfather's blood turned cold as ice when he read it. "Sorry about your cabin, Ronald. This wasn't personal, and we have no beef with you. Don't bother trying to find him. We were told to take care of him and to make him disappear. So he did." My grandpa said that those words were like a cold hand around his heart, that they made him feel sick to his stomach when he read them. He panicked and started shouting for Walter, but he knew deep down that there wasn't going to be a response. Whoever Walter had messed with had taken care of business, and that was the end of it. Grandpa raced back home and called the authorities, telling the cops that he thought that someone had been murdered in the cabin. Their investigation ended up yielding more questions than answers. Of course, back then, forensics wasn't exactly a super complex thing. The only clue was the blood, the knife, and the note. And Walter was never found, dead nor alive. A fact that hovered over my grandfather for probably the rest of his life. The cabin was a crime scene for a while, and the officers and investigators coming through every once in a while to try to find clues, or to ask my grandfather questions, but after a little while it was released back to him to do with as he pleased. My grandpa ended up moving all of his tools and everything he needed out of the cabin. It burned everything else in it, and then boarded up the husk that he left behind. He wanted to demolish it, but he never did. I think that it haunted him too much to do so. Like, he wanted to, but then kept telling himself that maybe Walter would come back. The only time that I went out to that side of the property as a kid, my father told me the story of what happened, and I saw that the building had pretty much been destroyed by nature. Overgrown, wood rotting out, and so forth. My uncle ended up taking over the land, as my father had moved out of state, so he offered it to him instead, when both my grandparents had passed away. My uncle did end up demolishing the old cabin, so there's nothing left there now but the memories of what happened. As of today, Walter's case is obviously on ice. No evidence, no new leads, and everyone involved is probably gone by now. But whatever ended up happening to Walter, based on the state of that cabin, I have to imagine that it wasn't quick, nor painless. Back in the fall of 2022, I went on a date with a guy named Lewis. We matched, had a lot in common, and after talking for about 2 weeks, we decided to meet up. We went to a nice restaurant nearby. I was wearing one of my favorite skirts, a flattering top, did my hair and makeup, and was just looking forward to a great night. I spotted him standing near the entrance when I arrived, and he was stunning. He was wearing maroon dress pants and a matching jacket, with a black shirt underneath. With his dark hair and bright green eyes, he looked great standing there waiting for me. So, when I walked up, I complimented him and he returned it. We got to our seats, our meals shortly after, and really enjoyed the dinner. The night was going great, but I perked up even more when he mentioned an old abandoned building that he knew about. One thing we had actually bonded over was our love for urbex, or exploring abandoned buildings and places. We talked about places we had explored and shared pictures, and talked about finding a place that we could explore together. So I instantly had the itch to check this place out that he said he'd found. Now, I know, record scratch right there. Some people would never meet a stranger privately, let alone in some abandoned building, but that's how some of us urbex people are. We liked the thrill and the risk. So when he offered to take me there, I was all for it. So when we finished our meals, we then went out to our cars, and I would be following him on my own. I always kept a pair of sneakers and an old pair of pants in my car, so I was a little better dressed for the occasion. However, Lewis opted to remain in his suit. I made a comment about it, thinking if he was hoping I would agree, why not bring something to change into? And that's why I always kept an extra outfit in my car. But, alas, it was his choice. And maybe he'd been here before, so I didn't think too hard about it. So, we approached the door, him leading, and when we got there, he rammed the door with his shoulder, and with a loud thud, it opened. I flinched at first because it was loud, and I didn't want someone to hear us and possibly call the cops. The building used to be an old daycare center that had a new strip mall being built nearby. The building was surely going to be torn down soon, as it would be an eyesore to the new shops and apartments being built. So it was possible that people would see us and report it. But after looking around and not seeing anyone, Lewis waved me in, shutting the door behind me. It was pretty dark at this point, so Lewis used his cell phone light, and I pulled out my mini flashlight that I had on my keychain, always prepared. I could see the once colorful wallpaper peeling off the walls, and there was a front desk covered in dust and a few visitor tags. As we walked through some of the rooms, we could see toys and play sets, but it had all been shoved to one corner of the room. And that was for all of the rooms. It was curious to see because I started thinking about what led to this place being left as it was. Did they move to a different building? If so, why not take your stuff with you? And if they closed for good, why not donate some of the things like the toys? I always felt like it was such a waste to see so much stuff left behind, just to be thrown into the landfill when someone else could have used it. But then I noticed more about the rooms. The chairs in the rooms, be it the small children's chairs or normal folding chairs, were all in a line, facing the blank walls. I thought a whiteboard or something similar used to be there, as the color of the wall was slightly different. Seeing it in one room was odd, but by the fourth time, I was curious. So I pointed it out to Lewis. He smirked and also said that it definitely looked odd with no context, and I started agreeing until it finally processed what he said. "What do you mean, no context?" I asked him suspiciously. He again smiled and took my hand and said that he wanted to show me something. He started leading me towards a hallway that had a sliding glass door that appeared to have some kind of paper taped on it, or maybe to have been painted over, so that you couldn't see through it. It was still pretty dark, and forgive me for not inspecting the door more. But as we walked towards the door, I could at least tell that something was covering it, as there was a slight glow to it. Like the door looked like it was glowing. I stopped a little further back from the door and let go of his hand, which got his attention too. He turned around and asked if I was okay, and I told him that I was getting a bit spooked. His comment earlier was suspicious, and now he was leading me to this room, and I was starting to realize my mistakes. Lewis, again, gave me his soft smile and said that everything was okay, and that neither him nor anything else was going to hurt me, and that he would make sure of it. He just wanted to show me what he'd found in the room when he went there alone. Again, I should have said no. I should have tried to run when I had the chance, when he wasn't so close to me. Who knew what would be behind that door? But for some reason, I felt like I could trust him. He seemed very sincere, never once pushing or forcing me along. For the most part, I led the way. He held my hand on our way to the room, but it wasn't a firm hold, and he let go when I let go. I guess thinking about it now, I could see why girls fell for Manson. Lewis was very nice on the eyes. He was kind, very convincing, so I agreed to go with him. So we got to the door and he asked if I was ready. I gave a shaky reply, and he slowly slid open the door. What I saw was definitely unexpected. Candles and books lined the floor. There were about a dozen people sitting on the floor with their legs crossed, both men and women. They all held hands and held their heads up with their eyes closed. There was one man standing in the center of them facing us, smiling. And they were all wearing the same thing. The men were in maroon suits. The women were in some kind of maroon hooded robe. They all matched the same kind that Lewis was wearing. What the hell did I just get myself into? The man standing in the center welcomed us with a soft voice, which made everyone else slowly look down at us. Lewis immediately kneeled and greeted the man. I forget what he called him now. Lewis then told him my name and wanted to introduce me to his family, as he put it. The standing man reached his arms out, and not wanting to set someone off, I held my hand out to shake his. He grabbed my hand with both of his, slowly caressing it, and telling me how I was always welcomed there. He then went on to speak about their mission, I guess. He explained how they were Earth's children, and they found buildings like this, and that they would pray in it to calm the planet, and offer it back to them. Stupid me was curious, and I asked how they gave it back. And the man smiled and said, "We baptize it, my child." He asked if I would like to join the prayer and experience one for myself, saying once I saw one, I would understand and fall in love. Everyone was staring at me, waiting for my response, but while nothing was really happening at this moment, I was kind of terrified. He was speaking in clear English, but I felt like everything was cryptic. I started hunching over a bit and said to Lewis that I felt like I was going to be sick, and that I needed some air first. He rubbed my back and said that he would help me out, and motioned to the others that he would be back soon. Once we got outside, I made a mad dash to my car, got in, and I locked it immediately. Lewis slowly walked up to my car, not shouting at me or anything. Again, making me feel like maybe I overreacted. So I rolled my window down a bit, allowing him to talk. He only asked if I was okay, to which, now feeling safe in my running car, I asked him what the hell that was all about, and if he thought that that was funny. He again smiled and said that they were his family, his chosen family. He said that they would never harm me. In fact, everyone there was willingly there, and that they only wanted to offer abandoned and forgotten places back to the earth. He explained how we humans just use whatever piece of land we want, when we want to build what we want, not considering the life we were taking away. Then, when we're done, and the buildings have nothing left and they're no longer of use, we just leave these eyesores. So their job was to pray for forgiveness and offer it back to the earth. I asked how exactly they could give it back, and what he meant by baptizing it. He smiled and explained that it was however the planet chooses to take it back, giving some examples. Sometimes the building collapses, is overgrown by nature, sometimes they even flood and slowly crumble, or possibly fire. I started asking him if he meant he catches these places on fire, and he laughed, and said that they never touch the buildings, claiming it was the work of the prayer and what the planet decides to do. He then made the comment about how I knew of these abandoned places, and thought that I would be interested in this, suggesting that I stay to witness a prayer. I told him that I would think about it, but that I had to go. He smiled again and waved at me goodbye without a hint of anger or disappointment in his voice. I don't know if that freaked me out more, or if it made it better. I got home and immediately called my friend to tell her the crazy-ass date that I had just experienced. She thought that it sounded just as crazy, and suggested we look into abandoned places nearby that were destroyed to see what we could find. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious. After we looked, there was one building almost 2 months prior to this event, where it had been sitting empty for nearly a year. Someone had recently bought it, hoping to fix it up and turn it into an indoor water park. And then, for some reason, and completely random, a pipe burst in the building, flooding it, rendering it completely damaged. It would have cost more to repair it, so what was left was demolished. Then we found a building in a state over from us that had been empty even longer. I had actually once been in that building, and structurally it seemed completely fine. However, one whole side of the building collapsed, so the city voted or something to have it torn down as well. As we continued looking at these places, comparing ones that we'd previously explored, we kept finding all these places with similar outcomes. And while I can't prove anything, I wonder if they were related. I'm not religious, nor do I really believe in the paranormal, but this really had me thinking. Were they doing something that could cause the Earth to take over these buildings? Or am I sounding just as crazy as they are? Or was this all just a big coincidence? And before anyone asks, yes, I really did contemplate and consider contacting the police. But then I just thought about what I would even tell them. Yeah, I broke into an abandoned building and there were people in there that prayed to the earth, and those natural-seeming things that happened to the buildings may not have been so natural. They may have just locked me up instead. So, no, I did not report it. And when Lewis asked me about another date, I just told him that I wasn't interested, and then never heard from him again. But sometimes, I get paranoid when my friends and I go urbexing, and even more suspicious when something happens to the buildings. Hi there. This was something that happened to me back when I was going on 15 years old. It all seemed to happen pretty fast, but within those 2 days, I felt a lot of emotion and carried even more guilt and trauma afterwards. However, I feel like it's important to talk about in order to educate others of online safety. I am a middle child, with an older brother that had already moved out of home, an older sister that, at the time of this event, was a senior and was about to graduate from high school, and then I have younger twin brothers. The following is going to be describing my mental state at that time. I understand that it wasn't the truth now, as I am an adult and parent myself, but it's how I felt at the time. My brother was in college, so my parents did a lot of stuff to get him set up in his dorm. With my sister graduating soon, they were preoccupied with her, getting her ready for it, trying to schedule a graduation party and everything that involved. Then, my younger brothers were still infants, so, of course, they took up a lot of my parents' time and attention too. So in my eyes, I felt as if they had forgotten about me. Or maybe just didn't require their attention when in fact, it was the opposite. I struggled with some of my school stuff. I had friend and teacher problems. There were days that I may have been picked on at school and just didn't feel good enough. But my parents didn't seem to care, or were too preoccupied to care. And so because of the distance between us, and them taking a "you're independent now and don't need us" stance, I dedicated my time to the internet. I played games with my friends, we would go to different chat rooms or just share random videos. And, when my friends weren't available, I would browse chat rooms and other public places. Don't worry, you don't have to tell me how stupid that was as a 15-year-old. While I was in the chat rooms, I would share quotes to my favorite songs, especially if they expressed how I was feeling. And that's how I met Angel. Or at least, that was the name that he gave me. I had posted the lyrics to a song and he had finished them. We started talking from there about the bands that we liked, and the rest was history. We seemed to have a lot in common. He explained how he was a middle child of 3. He felt similar to how I felt, and we shared a lot of interest and hobbies. He admitted that he was 17, though, and that he lived a couple states over. I knew stranger danger was still a thing, so I only gave him my nickname that my close friends used, not my real name, and just gave the state that I lived in. He never tried to push the subject of personal info, and I appreciated that. He just listened to anything that I had to say or complain about, and would try to comfort me. Over the next few weeks, I grew to love coming home and talking to him about my day. We both seemed to be getting more comfortable with each other, and when he said he cared about me, I fell for it. I had never been in a relationship before, so I was starting to feel like that was it. So I told him my real name, and I even added him on MySpace. Of course, when that happened, we knew what each other looked like. He looked exactly as he described. Dark, shorter hair with thin black glasses. He was cute, and probably more so because of the way that he treated and cared for me. He didn't even have many friends on MySpace, which made sense, because he explained how he was a bit of a loner and didn't have many friends in real life. But what really did it for me was when he started saying how pretty I was. He said that he saved my pictures so that he could look at them whenever he wanted, and how much he could not stop thinking about me. So, when he officially asked me out soon after, I accepted. Now I was in my first relationship, and since we couldn't even meet up, I didn't really know how we would handle it. Life was pretty much the same, except we had pet names and exchanged I love yous. We also started making plans together, and he said that once he graduated high school, he was going to get his own place, as he was currently living at home with his mom, and that way I could move in with him when I graduated too. I loved it. And the idea of being an adult away from a loveless family and having my own place sounded like a dream, and Angel was going to make it come true. So, I did everything that I could to make sure nothing stood in the way of those goals. Unfortunately, some things happened that were out of my control. As mentioned before, my friends and I were far from popular, so we were often bullied. However, I usually just let it go and just dealt with it. Until one girl said something that set me off, and I hit her. I hit her hard enough to make her fall back, and I just walked away, but she jumped on my back and made the fight bigger and attracted attention. We were both given in-school suspension, which just meant that we had to sit in the same room for 8 hours instead of going to each individual class. We even had to eat lunch in that room. But my parents' punishment was just as bad to a 15-year-old me. I was grounded for 2 weeks. I couldn't leave the house, except for school, obviously. No phone and no extra fun things. They wouldn't listen to me when I tried to explain what led to the fight, only that what I did was wrong and that I was smarter than that, and so on. So, I was confined to my room for those 2 weeks. However, my computer was a large desktop. It used to be my grandma's and she gave it to me, so my parents had no intentions of lugging it out of my room. So, I at least had access to that. And they also knew that I used it for schoolwork, so that's probably why I was allowed to use it. But being the person I was, I took it as a personal attack, and I unloaded on Angel about what had happened. To my surprise, he was enraged for me. He said my parents should have stuck up with me because I did it to protect myself. It only confirmed my feelings more about how my parents didn't care and how much Angel did. That's when Angel came up with the idea of me moving in with him now. I laughed at it, as if that would ever happen, or as if my parents would ever allow it, especially now. But he convinced me that I didn't need their approval. He explained how, at the age of 15, I was old enough to choose where I lived, and I could even choose to continue going to school or drop out if I wanted to. But he said I could just go to the high school that he was going to. And, to be honest, I loved the idea. I wanted to be close to him and far away from my uncaring parents, so with him adding a few more pros to the list, I finally agreed. He said that he had a car and a license and agreed to pick me up, but it would take a few days for him to get there. So I continued life as normal, as he instructed, so as to not alert anyone. I did tell a few of my friends about Angel previously, so all I told them was that I might get to meet him soon, and would message them about it when I did. Angel emailed me one night saying that he was in the state, and we planned for him to pick me up at school the next morning, as I waited for the bus to school. My sister drove herself, but I told her that I wanted to take the bus that day. Sometimes I did, especially when I was in a bad mood. So she didn't think anything of it, I'm sure. My dad was gone by 6 a.m., and my mom left with my brothers before me to take them to daycare and go to work. I was typically the last one home when I took the bus, so it worked out. I grabbed my 2 bags that I had packed with my clothing and some of the things that were important to me, and waited in the driveway with them. Then, the moment I had been waiting for since we started dating, Angel pulled into our driveway. I was overwhelmingly nervous and excited to finally meet him in person, but then it all came crashing down. The man that got out of the car was almost unrecognizable. He was far older than his picture. What hair he did have was black, but he was practically bald. He was overweight and wearing what I referred to as large grandpa glasses. I thought, what the heck, is this Angel's dad? But when he spoke and called me his pet name, I knew what had happened. I asked him why he looked so different, and he just acted like it was a small difference. He said that picture was a year old and that he had gained some weight, but it was still him. He even seemed embarrassed at first and apologized, but his voice was very soft and kind the whole time, which just reminded me of the Angel that I knew. I was still nervous about it, but I figured that I'd come this far that I had to go through with it. So he helped me put my bags in the car, and I got in the passenger seats and looked at the house one last time. But soon after, everything would come crashing down further, and I would realize my mistakes. Angel said that we would stop at a hotel for the night, and then we would be back at his home the next day. I was still nervous and shy, so I talked very little, but he continued to try and communicate with me. The hotel that we stayed at was shady at best. We got in, and there was one bed, and it wasn't long before he made his advances. Like I said, I had never been in a relationship, so the thought of doing something like that was overwhelming for me. I denied his advances, and that only angered him. He practically threw a tantrum, punching and throwing things, until he finally passed out. He demanded that I at least sleep in the bed with him, as I wouldn't leave the armchair, and I agreed, hoping to calm him down. I laid there until I knew that he was hard out, based on his drooling and snoring, and slowly got out of the bed. I knew that this was wrong. I knew who he was a lie, and he was not the person I was led to believe. And I knew that if I didn't get out of this somehow, I was going to be in a lot of danger. So I turned the TV up, hoping to mask any sounds that I made, left the room, and headed to the lobby. I remember the person at the front desk at first looking mean when we arrived, but I now believe he was suspicious of the grown man, checking into a hotel with a child. I told him that I needed to use the phone to call my mom, and I remember his face softening and asking if I knew that man. I told him no, and he immediately ushered me to the back office and gave me a phone. What I didn't know at the time was that he had already called the police. So, obviously, I'm okay now. My parents answered when I called in tears to hear my voice. Angel was arrested that night and questioned, and I got to stay in some children's room at the police station overnight. It was nicer than the hotel, at least. My parents picked me up the next day, and when I was expecting to be scolded and grounded longer, they hugged me like they had never hugged me before, and cried when they saw me. They of course knew that something was wrong when the school said I was absent, but that I wasn't home either. I told them everything that happened and even explained why I did it. And they explained that I was wrong and that they never stopped loving me and so forth. I realized I was wrong, and I learned that I needed to be more open about my feelings so that they knew what was wrong and what they could do to help. Angel obviously wasn't his real name, and he was not 17. He was actually in his 30s. He was charged, and he went to prison, which is why I won't share my location, as I don't want to be associated with this any more than this story, but there you have it. Even at the young age of 15, I was catfished, before I even knew what that meant. I absolutely learned my lesson, and realized it could have been a lot worse. I stress internet safety to my nieces and nephews all the time, and will do the same with my own children when they are old enough to venture onto the internet alone. I'm still pretty jarred from this experience, but I figured it would be easier to share about it than keep dwelling on it. A couple of days ago, someone broke into my house while I was asleep. I work night shifts, so sleep during the day is something you learn to get used to. Around 6:30 p.m., I heard what I thought was a loud knocking sound coming from outside, and my dog's going absolutely ballistic. For reference, I live on a farm out in the middle of nowhere. My closest neighbor is a half a mile away. But back to the story. I somewhat wake up, but don't really think anything of it since my neighbors like to shoot their guns, and this was during hunting season. As I start falling back asleep, my heart starts fluttering. Weird. Like I knew something wasn't right. And that's when I heard loud footsteps throughout the house. The dogs are still barking, but start to quiet down. That's when I begin to really worry. When I think my dogs would protect me in a time like this, fat chance. The footsteps stop on the other side of my bedroom door and doesn't move. I think, this is how I'm going to die. And although I had a weapon in my room, I knew that I couldn't get to it without being heard. It felt like an eternity before the steps move around and towards my brother's room. Rustling can be heard loudly through the house, and things being thrown. I knew they were in my brother's room. Some of his friends are into seedy situations, and I knew that it had to be one of them. I heard the footsteps coming back to my door and the doorknob handle move. I immediately turned my back towards the door and closed my eyes tightly, putting a hand over my mouth to stop from screaming. The door opens, but that's it. Then he leaves as a car drives down the road. I finally bucked up my courage to get out of bed. Everything in the house, except for my brother's room, was undisturbed. I immediately called my brother and asked if any of his friends were coming over. He said not that he knew of, and then I told him what happened. He got off the phone with me to start calling around. I went back to bed and noticed that I still had my window cracked open from earlier and realized that I had my sheet off of me, wearing only a t-shirt to bed. If it was who I think it was, this was not a random event. One of my brother's friends has always had eyes for me, and the fact that he saw me sleeping and in just t-shirt makes me freak out. Whether or not he took something out of my brother's room, or knew that I was home alone sleeping before having to work later that night, I don't know. I'll post an update when I hear from my brother. You move out to the country to get away from the activity of city life, and you let your guard down. And that's when something like this happens. Sometimes country life isn't so safe after all. Update. Sorry y'all for the late update. It's been a crazy week, but thank you for bearing with me. My brother got back with me with news that I absolutely dreaded hearing. None of his friends said or claimed to have been at the house at the time of the incident. So now I'm even more afraid of who was at my home, and what their intentions were. They could have been scoping out my house during the day, now that my county has decided to extend the gravel on my road that connects to the farming community that I live near. I just hope that I don't have another visit like that anytime soon. But if there is a next time, I'll be sure to be ready for them. Hi, Raven. First, I want to thank you for your hard work. I appreciate that you give a voice to so many stories. Thank you. I would like to share a very personal story that took place nearly 4 years ago on Halloween night. During that time, the world was under lockdown due to the pandemic, and Halloween celebrations were non-existent. Only trick-or-treating was permitted. I was feeling depressed and anxious, as I was in my mid-20s and still unsure about my life's direction. And that night, I was chatting with a guy I had dated named Leo, who shared many interests with me, such as our love for art and the macabre. Conversations with him were effortless. However, our relationship didn't work out because I had personal issues and saw too much of myself in him, which made me feel vulnerable. I made the difficult decision to end our relationship, which surprised and saddened him, and as a result, we lost contact. On that Halloween night, my roommate was out of town, and I wanted to make the most of the occasion. I suggested to Leo that we take a walk to discuss the brief time we had spent together, now that enough time had passed for us to reflect with a calm mindset. He agreed. And so after meeting at our meeting spot at around 9:30 p.m., we decided to walk through the old part of town where we lived. This area used to be bustling with tourists, restaurants, and bars, even during nighttime. However, on that night, it was eerily empty. We encountered only a few scattered individuals as we strolled along. Both of us were fast walkers, and before we knew it, we found ourselves deep in the old town, near the castle, a prominent symbol of our city. We faced a choice: either retrace our steps and follow the same path back, or continue alongside the castle, walking along the cliff's edge on a narrow boardwalk covered in foliage, eventually leading to a large park. The second option seemed more unsure as it was dark and desolate at that time of night. However, we were so lost in our conversation, and we chose to proceed without even thinking about it. As we ventured down the dimly lit path, unease began to settle in. And since it was Halloween night, I started joking about shadows and sharing spooky stories, as one would do around a bonfire. And the path was illuminated by lampposts, and one particular light was flickering, which sent a shiver down my spine. We paused there, and I remarked on how creepy the area felt, like the perfect setting for a scene in a slasher movie. Although we laughed, I couldn't shake off the underlying fear of being alone and far from help. Strangely, despite our brief and complicated dating history, and his affinity for the dark and macabre, I felt safe with Leo. After approximately 10 minutes of walking along the eerie path, we finally reached the park and began making our way back to our meeting point. Along the way, we passed the entrance to the old town, where we noticed police cars entering amid a commotion. Curiosity led us to inquire about the situation with a bystander. He informed us that there was a man roaming around with a knife, scaring people. I felt perplexed, trying to recall if we had encountered anyone suspicious during our walk, but I couldn't remember. Brushing it off as a Halloween prank taken too far by an intoxicated man, I thought nothing more of it. Oh, how mistaken I was. The bystander suggested that we go home and lock ourselves in. I escorted Leo to his place and then hurried back to mine, feeling a sense of unease. It was only upon returning home that the gravity of the situation truly sank in. I came across numerous posts detailing the event that had unfolded, and as I pieced everything together, I began trembling uncontrollably. I realized that choosing the eerie boardwalk may have saved both mine and Leo's lives. And this is what happened. On Halloween night in 2020, around 10:30 p.m., a man dressed in medieval attire carried out a mass stabbing near the provincial legislature, the National Assembly of Quebec, in Quebec City. Armed with a katana-style saber, he randomly attacked innocent people. Tragically, 2 individuals lost their lives, and 5 others were injured. Understanding what happened with the information I had at that time, I couldn't stop shaking. Even now, the memory sends shivers down my spine. A mentally ill man slashing people on the night of Halloween seems like something straight out of a horror movie. But all of it was real. When I pieced back the events of the night, I realized that the attack must have started right behind us, at the foot of the castle, when we decided to walk on the dark path ahead of us. It hit me that if we had chosen to retrace our steps, we would have almost certainly crossed paths with the assailant. It was surreal to think that a seemingly insignificant and eerie decision like walking forward had saved our lives. Furthermore, I discovered that a friend of mine had also been walking alone that very night, not far from us. Unfortunately, he wasn't as lucky as Leo and me. He was attacked and left for dead, barely surviving. As a result of the attack, he still bears scars and lost one of his fingers. However, I am amazed by his resilience, and I can confidently say that he is thriving today. Reflecting on that Halloween night, I realized how unpredictable life can be, and how seemingly inconsequential decisions can have profound impacts. This event truly shook me to the core, serving as a wake-up call. Shortly after, I made the decision to seek the help I needed for my mental health, and it completely transformed my life. As a result of this sequence of events, I discovered my path and purpose. Today, I'm actively involved in the field of mental health, and I see a bright future ahead of me. When I reflect on that fateful night, I'm filled with gratitude for being alive and for choosing to walk on the dark path. It's a reminder that sometimes the safest path may not be the safest at all. Life is unpredictable, and we truly never know what lies ahead. I'd been single for quite a while when this took place. It didn't bother me any either. I was enjoying the bachelor life. I went on dates with some women that I met through apps, as well as some that I had mutual friends set me up with. And that's actually how I met Cora. She worked with a friend of mine, Leslie. I met Cora at a business party that Leslie took me to as her +1 at the time. We'd been friends for a very long time. We tried dating, but we just didn't vibe that way, but we've always remained good friends. So, she took notice when I was looking at Cora. Cora was very attractive. Long, blonde, curly hair, bright blue eyes, and very tall. Even better, she was very outgoing. She introduced herself and said that everyone called her Barbie because of how she looked, too. We joked about it, and later on in the date, Leslie called me out on my glances, and there was no denying it. So, she said that she would play matchmaker and ask Cora about it the next day they worked. Lucky for me, Cora was also interested in me, and Leslie gave her my number. She messaged me immediately, and the conversation was easy for both of us. We talked about work and life and set up a date for the following weekend. The night of our date started out great. We actually met at a restaurant/entertainment place. As in, we had dinner, and then they had the whole arcade and bowling alley that we enjoyed together. She looked stunning in these shiny black pants and a top, and then she was wearing sneakers. She joked about not looking at her feet, but she wanted to be comfortable when we bowled. That night was fantastic, and while we both had a few drinks, her a little more than me, she became very flirtatious and suggestive. And I was all for it. After a few hours there, she invited me back to her place, and I didn't decline. She had taken an Uber, but I drove, so I offered to take us there. I knew that I had to drive, so I didn't drink that much. When we got there, before she opened the door, she reminded me of her nickname at the office, and I confirmed that I remembered it. And then she said her looks were only part of the reason she liked being called Barbie. and that she was excited to show me. I was curious, but I was thinking, so she liked to collect dolls? Okay, no big deal. Everyone has their collection or hobbies, right? My sister still has a bunch of dolls that she's collected. My brother and I still have boxes of baseball cards. Nothing to be worried about. But no, this was a little more than just a collection. She turned on the light, and her walls and shelves were filled with dolls. Barbies and other similar dolls, as well as a few porcelain dolls. I was surprised. She giggled and said that she loved them. She loved to collect them, and she even sometimes bought broken ones and repaired them, saying that she had her own doctor's office/workshop in her spare bedroom for them. She even talked about how she's made decent money repairing other people's dolls. Yeah, I wasn't expecting this, but I mean, it wasn't that bad. It was one hell of a hobby and I guess a side gig for her, but it's not a deal breaker. Far from it for Cora. But then she said that the ones that were truly special to her were in her workshop, and to make sure that they aren't hurt. She took me to the room, and again, shelves lined the top of the walls, and they were all filled with porcelain dolls. She called these her family. She started naming them off. Dolls named after her parents, her grandparents, her sister, her old teacher, and even 2 of her exes. She even showed me a picture that was hanging on the wall of her sister, comparing it to the doll, and it was uncanny how much they matched. Shoulder-length hair, curly, light brown. She had blue eyes and a mole above her left eye, and had on the same dress her sister was wearing in the photo. She said that her sister had thrown out the dress, so she snagged it, and made the dress for the doll out of it. She explained how she still cared for her exes, so she made them into dolls too. Then, she giggled and mentioned how she couldn't wait to make a doll for me. I'm sure that she meant that to be lighthearted, and maybe even funny. It was obviously something she did, but it was actually kind of creepy to me. It was like someone admitting to wanting a voodoo doll of you. I don't know how else to explain it, so I just let out a nervous laugh and she led me out of the room and went back to the Cora that I knew from our date. She kissed me and said that her bedroom was the best place in the house, and then led me to the other room with the closed door. I just prayed that it didn't have any dolls in it. She opened the door and, to my surprise, there were no dolls in the walls, sitting on the dressers or the shelves. So I felt that I could finally relax. I remember telling myself that I was just kind of being an ass about it. And while it may seem weird to me, it was something that she enjoyed. And, ultimately, I could live with that. Until I tried to lay on her bed, and then felt something under the blanket. As a person's normal reaction, I moved quickly, not wanting to hurt or damage whatever it was. Cora giggled and leaned over me to pull the blanket back and revealed a nearly life-sized doll laying in her bed, smiling. I'm a little over 6 feet, and that thing had to be about 4 or 5 feet easily. And Cora began telling me who the doll was. She told me his name, some of his history, and then told me why he was in her bed in the first place. I'll let you fill in the blanks there. She even suggested that we could include it in our night's activities. I tried to remain as polite as possible and told her that I just wasn't quite into that. However, instead of being a little understanding, she became upset, saying that those dolls were her babies, her life, and if I wanted to be with her, that I had to be with her dolls, too. So, I left the room. I grabbed my stuff and walked out of her apartment, trying to figure out what the hell I had just experienced. She messaged me the next day with a picture of herself and her bedroom doll, I guess, and said that I was welcome back if I ever changed my mind. I just couldn't picture doing literally anything in that place with 1,000 eyes staring at me, watching every move I made. I didn't check the bathroom, but I wouldn't doubt if she had some in there too. Thankfully, Cora at least made the conversation with Leslie easy. Cora told her that we just didn't click, so I didn't have to share my experience either, and I don't think I will past telling you, a random person on the internet. So I hope you enjoyed my slightly creepy and very uncomfortable first date. Back when I relied on dating apps, I matched with a girl named Caitlin. Her pictures showcased her long, dark blonde hair, bold green eyes, and a dazzling smile. She lived in the next city over and worked at a local hospital. That was actually something we shared. I was an RN at another hospital, so we shared some similar grievances and the parts that we loved in the field. After a few weeks and when our schedules finally lined up, we agreed to meet in person. We decided on a little brunch place, as we were both morning people, and I got there first to get us a good seat. I sat at the table and would occasionally look up from my phone, expecting to see her walk in at some point. I didn't see a pretty blonde that matched Caitlin's descriptions, so I was a bit startled when someone walked up and said my name. I looked up to see someone that looked similar, but wasn't quite what I was expecting. The woman had shoulder length and very dark brown hair, freckles, and dark eyes. I probably stared at her longer than I should have been. Then she held her arms out for a hug and said that she was Caitlin. I apologized and stood up to hug her and ushered her into the seat. I could tell by her facial features that this was the same person, same nose and eye shape. She even talked with the same cadence and personality, but she was clearly different. I tried to let it go, thinking maybe she just never updated her photos from the app, but the thoughts still lingered in my mind. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you look at it, my mouth is faster than my brain, and I finally asked about it. I told her that her hair looked nice, but that it was different from the photos, joking that I almost didn't recognize her. She laughed and casually brushed it off, explaining what I had assumed. She simply said it was an older photo and that she recently decided to change up her look out of boredom. I laughed with her and again complimented it, but something still didn't sit right with me. Yeah, she could have cut and dyed her hair, but how would she explain the different eye colors and freckles? Who would wear colored contacts on a first date on a whim? And her freckles were definitely real. They weren't fakes, so Photoshop? To cover your freckles? It was just all strange to me because the woman now sitting in front of me was just as attractive. So why fake a profile photo? Regardless, I tried to not be an ass and dwell on it, and still give her a chance. But as our date progressed, she started acting odd. She would go from being very talkative and giddy and then become very hands-on and flirtatious. Don't get me wrong, it was nice to see her so interested in me, I guess, but I couldn't figure out if it felt rehearsed and faked, or if she was just really excited. It was as if we knew each other and hadn't seen each other in some time. And once again, as the conversation slowed down, I took it as my chance to ask. I joked with her about how the date seemed to flow so easily. It was as if we were friends, and I then asked her if we really did know each other. I was expecting her to laugh and smack my arm or something, but she broke eye contact with me and with a nervous laugh just said, "Oh, not really, I don't think," and then quickly tried to change the subject to something else. That made me a bit suspicious. So I moved on, but kept trying to place her somewhere in my earlier life. Once we were finished, we started heading out to the parking lot, and she again started getting really flirty and making suggestions. We met up for brunch. I had no intentions of taking a girl home in the middle of the day. I had a few reasons, but it just seemed weird. So I just told her that I had fun and that I would love to see her again. It wasn't a lie. She seemed happy at first, but then I could see her disappointment. She made comments about how she wasn't good enough for me. I tried to comfort her, but wasn't sure what to say because I barely knew her. Then she made a comment about how she knew I liked brunettes more, so she had tried to change. I was confused. How would she know what I liked? We had just met. I didn't mention that on my profile because it wasn't that big of a deal to me, so I asked her how she would know that, and then she turned to anger. She said, "So you don't even recognize me? That is so like you, Jason." What the hell was going on here? I felt like I was part of some joke that I wasn't let in on. I told her that I didn't recognize her and specifically mentioned how she didn't even look anything like her bio anymore. So she slapped me and walked off. I stood there dumbfounded by this whole thing. I thought I matched with some random blonde woman. A dark-haired woman with freckles showed up and I was supposed to recognize her? Which one? I just went home thinking about it the whole time. I went back to her profile and really tried to study the way she looked, the words used in her bio, anything I could to figure out the answers to this test that I obviously failed. But I found nothing. But, to my surprise, Caitlin messaged me the next day. She apologized for how she reacted and said that it wasn't my fault, and that she would love to see me again. Yeah, I was a little hesitant on that one. I did apologize as well and said that I wouldn't mind the same, but that I needed to know who she really was. No more secrets. That was not the way to start a relationship. She agreed, and after seeing the dots starting and stopping multiple times, she finally responded, and said that we went to school together and that's why she was so excited to see me. But that she overreacted and that it wasn't a big deal. I thought, okay, high school was over 15 years ago, so forgive me for not remembering everyone I went to school with. But I did apologize for not recognizing her, and agreed on a second date. I assumed maybe she was willing to explain more anyways, and we could just reminisce. I didn't mind possibly dating someone from my old school days. We set it up for the following weekend, for dinner this time. I have an older sister by 2 years, and we'd been up talking one evening when the subject of school came up. It reminded me of my date, and I started telling her about it, wondering if she maybe remembered someone named Caitlin. I didn't tell people about every date I went on, so this was the first time she'd heard about it. She said that she didn't recall the name at first, but then I described what she looked like. She then mentioned how the dark hair and freckles sounded like my old high school girlfriend, but her name wasn't Caitlin. It was Mercedes. She wasn't wrong, though. Mercedes had dark hair and eyes and freckles, but surely it couldn't have been her. Why would she use a different name? We broke up because we kind of just grew apart. We dated for part of our freshman year through our junior year. It wasn't anything crazy or dramatic. If I saw it was her on the site, I still probably would have said yes. We were adults now, and probably completely different people. My sister said that she would think about it more, pull out her yearbooks, and let me know if she figured anything out. In the meantime, Caitlin and I chatted occasionally throughout the week, but she never gave me any other ideas of who she was. Then, my sister called me back. She mentioned a girl that she saw in our yearbook, and it made her instantly think of Caitlin. Unfortunately, the person she's telling me about, I wanted to never have to deal with again. She, throughout my junior and part of my senior year, was basically a stalker. She followed me around at the school screaming how much she loved me. She would call my house all hours of the night. She followed me into the boys' restroom at school and even tried to tell my mom that I had gotten her pregnant. I never even really talked to this girl. We had one class together, and she always just stared at me. However, she had 2 classes with Mercedes, and she was always mean to her. But her name wasn't Caitlin. At least, not her first name. I started looking for her on Facebook, and sure enough, I found her profile. But she was going by her middle name, which was Caitlin. My stalker had managed to match with me, and I fell right into it. And when she immediately spotted me, she must have changed her whole look to look like Mercedes. Who does that? I knew that I couldn't let this go on. To me, she obviously hadn't changed, so I called it off. I sent her a message using her first name and told her that I didn't think it would be a good idea to continue. She came unglued. She confessed how much she loved me and always had, how I just needed to give her a chance, how it was meant to be since I matched with her. I told her it was a mistake and how she kind of set me up. That did not go over well, and let's just say that cued the stalking all over again. I ended up having to file a restraining order again to get her to leave me alone, and I became a bit more cautious with who I matched with online. However, after a while, I did actually reconnect with Mercedes after all this, and it's safe to say that we've become decent friends again. The story happened 3 years ago, around the time that COVID started, so it was a while back, but still worthy of a post. It was early 2020, and I had just gotten a new job in a small town near my area. While looking for a place to live, my sister offered to rent her house to me. She'd bought the house 2 years prior, but she and her husband didn't really take to it, and their commute to work was long, so they moved out, and the house was uninhabited. Luckily for me, it was actually pretty close to my workplace, around a 40-minute drive, and my sister pretty much rented it to me for free. I just paid for the water and electricity and looked after the house. I was living there for a solid 2 or 3 months, and had already gotten used to it. One night, after coming back from work and parking my car, as I walked towards my door, I noticed something odd. There was a cigarette butt on the curb to my house. I leaned down and picked it up, thinking that it might have been mine since I am a smoker, but after looking at the brand name, I realized that it wasn't mine and threw it away. I didn't think much of it and just shrugged it off as some a-hole throwing it at my curb. I went on with my night and nothing unusual happened. 2 days later, I was once again walking to my house when I spotted a few more cigarette butts, this time near my porch. Needless to say, I was pissed off, and I thought that someone sat on my porch and smoked, but since I didn't know who it was, there was nothing I could do about it. I noticed that they were put out pretty recently, so whoever it was probably walked off as I was approaching. That night, I was watching a movie on my laptop, and it was pretty late, past 1 a.m., so I was surprised when I heard a car passing by. It's a suburban neighborhood, and it was COVID, so people rarely ventured out at night, but I didn't think much of it. Around half an hour later, I was surprised when I heard chattering nearby. I listened intently, but I couldn't hear what they were talking about, as their voices seemed almost muffled and quiet. By this point, I was getting a bit unnerved, so I stopped the movie and quietly got off of my sofa and walked to the front door to make sure that it was locked. As I was approaching the door, I froze mid-step as I heard the two approaching my porch, and reduced their talking to a whisper. I realized right away that whoever this was wanted to break in. I leaned against my door and waited, expecting a loud bang against the door or the doorknob being shaken, but it was oddly quiet. I decided to walk over to my window to see if they had walked away or changed their mind. My windows have bars from the inside out that you have to unlock so that you can move the curtains or look out the window comfortably. I slowly unlocked the bar mechanism and lifted it up. I moved the curtains and was taken aback. Leaning up against my window was a man. He was as startled as I was because he basically stuttered over his own steps as he jumped back. He tightened his hoodie to cover his face, so all I could really see was his big blue eyes looking at me. His friend realized what was going on, and right away started to kick the door in. He kicked it for a solid 4 or 5 times, but the door wouldn't budge. All the while I was staring at them frozen in fear and trying to comprehend the situation. I snapped out of it and slammed the bars over my window, locking them and running upstairs to the storage room where I pushed a table up to the door and called the cops. As I listened and expected the two to come inside any minute, I heard a loud crash and the bar from the windows being shaken aggressively. When they realized they couldn't get in, one of them let out a long, angry scream that probably woke up half of the neighborhood. By the time the cops came, they were long gone. The police couldn't find out who it was, but were more active in the neighborhood in the following weeks. Regardless, I wasn't too keen on staying there, so shortly after, I moved out. My sister sold the house a few months later, and as far as I know, nothing similar has happened since.